Hello, and welcome to another RedMonk Conversations video. My name is Kate Holterhoff, industry analyst here at RedMonk, and with me is Stephane Rodet, UX engineering manager at IBM. I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to discuss front-end development and design with Stephane today, as this is a subject near and dear to my heart. After a stint in academia, I worked as a front-end engineer for several years before transitioning to my current role as an analyst. I understand you've worn several professional hats as well, Stephane. Will you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became interested in design? What was that journey like?
Hey, Kate. Well, there's quite a bit to unroll. Let's try to make it short. I started quite a while ago at IBM after making a university exchange. So I started as a backend developer on a mainframe. So I was actually building a component that managed the processor capacity and so on dynamically on the mainframe. So it was a very cool, super interesting topic, far from the front end actually, but we had a desktop app that actually managed the software. And so I was assigned as a first assignment to actually test this desktop app. And so I opened so many tickets that the next iteration, they put me on the front end team and they were like, Stephane, now you're going to help fixing this. And so we quickly moved to actually one of the first web apps for the same management, actually. So it was a new initiative that became the so-called COSMF. So COS Management Facility was one of the first management system for the mainframe as a web basically app. So we were working with very early, a bit clunky kind of JavaScript tooling. So it was really interesting to see that evolve and start. And so after that, I got asked to come into one of the initial and first private cloud team at IBM. They were working on the initial private cloud products around 2009. And so I got asked to help for the front end. And so then we moved a bit. We were then using Dojo for producing our app. And this led me to become more and more interested into the UX topic. And actually at your conference, at the Monkey Gra conference, I listened to Phil Gilbert explaining IBM design. And I also heard a lot about it internally. And what happens in parallel is that I started to meet the design community in my location. And we started building bonds and meeting regularly. And at some point, one of the guy in the team, Garrett Fall, came to the idea, hey, what if we start our own studio? And so this was how we started the story of design at IBM Böblingen. We built a new studio and I joined the team like a few months afterwards because I was really inspired by that. And then came the question like, okay, you're joining the team, but what should be your role, right? And so I started with UX design, but very quickly there is someone who joined externally from the US who started this new practice of UX engineering and prototyping. And so very quickly we got in touch and this felt like the perfect fit actually. And so this is how it got all started. It was 7 years ago now, 2015. And so I've been evolving in this role since. So we've started an internal community of front end to upskill everyone into the modern techniques. And we've grown also into a more stronger team, and now it's even official because I got a department, so I'm now a UX engineering manager. And so this has been something very interesting, starting from this role that has been really a niche, and now it's being more acknowledged in the industry. So there are more and more companies who goes into that, and I can see also signs of company organizing their UX engineers now in structure and organization to make it scale.
That's a really exciting story. Thank you for sharing that. And I think maybe for our listeners here, it'd be worthwhile to pause and kind of dig into some of those roles. So, you mentioned a lot of terms here, and there's a lot of terms in general for UX engineers. So we've got a design developer, design technologist, creative developer, prototyper. What differentiates these, and how would you characterize that role for IBM specifically?
Yeah, it's pretty funny. So many names for a single role. And actually, Well, so if you know the role more narrowly, then there are some differences that start to appear. So let's start with the prototyper, because this one is pretty simple. The prototyper is a role that exists also in this pure design. So you can be a prototyper without coding. You will be the person who put the design together into scenarios, potentially designs also some animation and interaction between them. And so that will help you to get to the first prototype. And then the next step in this prototyping, of course, is to start to mix some code, but also why not to go completely with code, especially if you have a design system, you can plug and play the elements together. And the more mature your design system will be, the faster you'll be actually with all of that. So this is then really practical because you get to build some kind of, catalog of designs and interaction and so on. And then you get more and more productive and can show the prototype directly to the users. So this is the first step. The next one that I think is interesting is the creative developer. And also I think it goes along with a bit design technologies. And so the creative developer will also play with new technology, sometimes IoT, for example, to come up with new concepts, new possibilities that might go way beyond what just, the designer in front of the screen will think about. So this is a bit of a separate role, which I don't know we have in the company. And then design developer, UX engineer, personally, I consider them very much like synonyms. And sometimes I would even say it depends of, what organization are they reporting to and so on. But basically it's very similar responsibility. And then you have all kind of roles that comes into this. So for example, the UX engineer will be responsible for working on the design systems. They will be responsible for also prototyping with code, for sometimes coding some interaction. Sometimes they will go and help the developers to understand, to show them how to make a specific design happen. And sometimes they will also advise the designers on a specific technical matter, also to help them understand what's possible, what not, helping them with the domain knowledge also of the product.
Great. So it sounds like there's a lot of overlap there. I think what interests me about the front end space is how there is this, kind of this need to synthesize the roles that we all operate with, but also there's these kind of new divisions that we're seeing in the field. So that kind of reminds me of Chris Coyer's really important article, The Great Divide, which he wrote for CSS Tricks a few years back. And it outlines the disparities between front end engineers, particularly those who work heavily with JavaScript. On the one hand, as opposed to those who work with like HTML, CSS, design, interaction, patterns, accessibility, et cetera. And, that was actually more the side of the fence that I worked on. So I guess I'm curious, what strategies do you recommend for confronting and finding commonality in light of this division? How do we find, the areas where we can work together? And, where are you seeing the field move in terms of, this sort of division, which Chris Coyer outlined, in that seminal article?
Yeah, this is really a very revealing article. Like I was really, it sparked so many ideas in my head. And when I read this article, I was like, oh, finally someone put it on paper. And it's a really interesting case because very often in the IT, you have that kind of specialization happening, where a single role got divided into multiple, like backend developer, then you have the database developers, you have, I think people will hate if I say this, but the more kind of DevOps oriented roles. And so, but it starts from a common point. In that case of front-end development, you really have people coming from two different places, right? You have people coming from software development, engineering, sometimes even like backend development or at least application development, moving into front-end and having a little bit more to do with design, but maybe without having the kind of solidified or formal knowledge into the topic. And on the other side, you have the more, like I would say, the agency developer who would realize and prototype the ideas from designers, mainly for website, for communication supports. And so now those two roles have to come together to create more complex outcome. And I think that's the one kind of things that we worked on a lot at IBM Design, trying to bring those two kind of personas together, because you need both skills right now to make like complex web app happen, right? Because they are complex in the structure, but they need to look nice, they need to feel nice, they need to be usable, understandable, consistent vision. So there is a need to have those people speak together and as much as possible also exchange skills, right? So transferring knowledge is very important. So for example, what we did on our side, we created a community for those two categories, sort of more development, front-end developers and the UX engineers to come together. So this is very important. And try to fill the gaps a bit. Like if you are more of a backend developer, then let's have a look. Try to spend a week with designers. Try to use their tool a little bit as well. And the opposite side, right? If you are just a CSS developer or maybe a designer also know to code a little bit of front end, then you can have a look at other stuff. Like, I don't know, you can look at Python, you can look at trying to do your own data science. We have some people actually in our studio looked in that direction and that brought their skills on superpower, really. So there is the kind of strategy you can use. Also stay, keep the awareness here, try to keep a good contact, but also at the same time, I think this is a fine line to run on. Like what I've seen is that still the more what I would call CSS developer or maybe UX engineers, the CSS developer is more for what I would call the agency model, right? When you write primarily content that has a lot of editorial aspect, but not too much functional, right? And the UX engineer is a bit the evolution of that role, but more in a complex kind of application or even further enterprise kind of context, right? Because the UX engineer will also know how to plug JavaScript together, will make more complex work, software work together. So this is a bit the kind of differentiation I see. But still, if you take the CSS developer or the UX engineers, both tend to work a lot with design, although they are different, organization might place them into different reporting branch. But at least the way we found it works the best for us was to have the UX engineers tightly connected to the design. And how do we do that? We just place them in the design team, very simply, right? So they can actually act as designers also. They can sometimes help the designers work with them on common problems. And then keep the more, I would say, application engineer kind of persona also in tight contact with the other developers, right? So they can also have people who understand their way of thinking, of working, their evaluation, and so on.
I think the collaborative aspect of the sphere is something that maybe doesn't get spoken about enough. And you're completely right. In my experience, it really is. The idea of working together with folks on these projects can just be extremely liberating. And then another thing that I think we're seeing in the industry is just the sheer number of tools that are coming out to support folks who work in on these interactive teams. So I guess I'm curious a little bit about that aspect. So the velocity of the technologies that are emerging to support design disciplines, so design system management, design tools. So I'm thinking here of like Figma and Lottie and web and native platforms. It's extremely exciting, but also challenging to keep up with. Can you talk at all about how to stay ahead of these changes in the front end landscape?
Yeah, we see that as a big role of the UX engineer to keep up with those technology, and especially also help the designers to make sense of those technologies. Because, for example, sometimes there will be tools I don't know, like Airtable or Figma. Many of those design tools are actually highly pluggable, so you can write plugins for them to enable new functionality. So suddenly you make a design tool that's completely random and free to something that just, that's much more of a specialized toolbox for your component system. So you can make all new kinds of outcomes happen, and you can bring way more consistency and speed and so on in the workflow of the designers by plugging this in and sometimes writing a small piece of software. So we see that as a very big responsibility. At the same time, we also try to think all the time what's the value of the technology, because if you have too much movement and not enough stability, then at some point it starts to be detrimental. You start to having a disconnect, and people will just not keep up with the changing workflows and all of that. So there is always a fine line to be had in there, but we still think it's important to have certain people in the team that have some reserve time for looking at those tools, right? And you might decide it differently. In some places, you'll have dedicated teams. In some places, you'll have every folk who spend some time looking at new tools on a regular basis. I think it plays a big role also into motivating the people and making work like more enjoyable, especially when you know that you have some influence on the toolings and the workflow of the team. I think this empowerment is very, very important in general, but just also to keep up with the overall like productivity change and so on.
One last question for us, that I'm particularly curious about. So, when I typically think of testing, I think of it as the domain of the back end. And we spent a lot of time in this conversation talking about how there's actually a lot of back and forth between these, the full stack, developer seems to be, alive and well. So I guess I'm curious then, even though testing is not something that the front end is usually thought of as really dealing with, you have argued that actually is not the case, that it is important for folks in the front end to take on, the role of a tester. So could you expand on that idea?
Yeah. There are multiple levels to unpack with that, because there is some level of testing that I think is known to every front-end developer, or at least they aspire to, which is to use some front-end testing tool for their code, and having this run, like at least some base tests being run on every build and commits and so on. So this is definitely one aspect that is known. But I think when you look at the direction of UX engineering, what is the role of a UX engineer for testing? And this is where it gets very interesting, because when, for example, a UX engineer starts to produce some coded prototypes of a design, then you get a software implementation of the design, but with a fraction of the cost of the real thing, right? You don't need to care about all the dependencies, what the API might do or not. You can just test the interaction itself, right? So there is all kind of testing that you can have with the users. You can also, I think, as a UX engineer, you can use your skills to deploy, for example, different versions of a design. So you can compare the two solutions. We had that done recently by a team. It was really interesting to have the actual stuff being presented. So there is definitely a lot of potential in this. And then you go even further, like how is that about the responsiveness of the design? How's the accessibility? Can we make it accessible? What's about how do the animation on the micro interaction feel? There is a lot that you can do with the design tools, of course, but sometimes I've seen teams who weren't enough knowledgeable of the limitation of those tools, sometimes underestimate how much you can do more outside of that. And I would say even the design tools, when they have lots of them have a so-called prototype function, which can, like bring you through different states. But there are many scenarios in which it doesn't work anymore. So as long as you're writing a simple forms, you have a website, you want to navigate between elements, you want to highlight one or two elements, it's really fine, right? But as soon as you go into kind of a free world and kind of stuff, for example, you have my favorite example is a spreadsheet, right? you want to test if a spreadsheet interaction is working. Your user might be writing something anywhere, and then you need to show on any other place what's the results of that. So that's the kind of things that, with code, you can test very easily because you can just code it on the front end and then have a look and try it with users to see if it works.
Well, this has been an exciting conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot from you today, Stephane. Thank you so much for joining me for this RedMonk conversation. Learning how the front end UX and design continue to evolve, and especially at IBM, I think is a really important story to tell. So thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you, Kate, so much for this great discussion.